East St. Louis, Illinois, once named an All-American city, has now become America's Soweto. As world-renowned eco-womanist Alice Walker stated in Overcoming Speechlessness, rolling into Gaza City, I had a feeling of homecoming. There is a flavor to the ghetto, to the colored section. In some ways, it is surprisingly comforting, because consciousness is comforting. Everyone you see has an awareness of struggle, of resistance, just as you do. The city of East St. Louis, Illinois is America's Soweto, with the deepest flavors of the ghetto, consciously comforting. It is an awareness of an endurance, of struggle, and of resistance. East St. Louis offers one of the deepest illustrations of the exploitation of human and environmental life that America's hegemonic, heteropatriarchal, white supremacist plutocracy has perpetrated in perverse and pervasive ways. East St. Louis was once home to booming manufacturing and industry, promising a job to anyone who came. Historically part of the American Bottoms, current-day East St. Louis sits 6 miles from Cahokia Mounds. Cahokia Mounds was once home to one of the most sophisticated civilizations north of Mexico, rivaling cities established in London in 1250 AD. It's estimated that over 20,000 people subsisted off the land and enjoyed thriving livelihoods. Now, 6 miles away from the historic site, is one of the most distressed cities in America. The story of East St. Louis's modern destruction begins in the early 1900s, when industry and manufacturing began to grow exponentially. Companies flooded to the American Bottoms just across the river from St. Louis to exploit and capitalize on the local communities, resources, land, and people, without restrictions on emissions and waste. Most of the jobs available from these companies were low-paying, unskilled, labor-intensive, and oftentimes dangerous. Monsanto, one of the largest chemical companies of the 20th century, would incorporate into its own village, currently named Soweto, in 1926, marking the beginning of a methodic genocide perpetrated against the people, the land, their resources, and livelihoods through maximizing the capitalization and monopolization on profit over people and economic gain over life. During the decade that Monsanto incorporated into its own village to maximize its exploitation and capitalization on the communities and people of southwestern Illinois, East St. Louis had next to the lowest assets and value of public property, and very nearly the lowest in revenue receipts from taxes and expenditures for governmental purposes, leaving a community without necessary resources to protect itself from corporations like Monsanto. This mere concept of democracy, without the actual inception of democracy, allows for opportunities to redistribute harms onto marginalized citizens and onto less powerful communities. Pollution from the manufacturing and industries, and specifically Monsanto, in the East St. Louis area and surrounding communities, has left toxic waste and chemical pollutants in the soil, water, food supply, and people. Stockyards in abundance in the area were known for discharging their waste into the river. This was only a small fraction of the pollution that has plagued the American Bottoms for over a century. During the Great Migration of blacks from the South seeking employment in the North, advertisements placed in the southern states offered free train rides to black Southerners willing to seek employment in East St. Louis. As the number of African Americans increased, racial tensions between blacks and the majority white population began to rise. July 1917 would bring one of the worst race riots to occur on American soil. This racially inflicted violence was initiated by the very industries offering employment. As white workers were on strike at a local plant, African American workers were brought in to replace them. Race was used as a means and a reason for retaliation. after a car with a white male drove through an African American community in East St. Louis and fired gunshots out the window. The community returned fire as the next car with white passengers drove through the neighborhood. Chaos ensued. An exact figure of African American lives lost in the violence will never be known. Estimates include over 100 dead and over 300 homes in predominantly African American communities burned. As in every ghetto, an awareness of struggle and conscious spirit of resistance was stirred, and the infamous East St. Louis race riots of 1917 ensued. Many African Americans left for St. Louis across the river to escape the violence inflicted by whites for simply possessing melanin in their skin. It is estimated that the African American population declined 25% after the race riots. In the aftermath of the riots, East St. Louis would go through many changes.
And until the ignoble and unhappy regime that hold our brothers in Angola, in Mozambique, South Africa, subhuman bondage have been toppled, totally destroyed. Well, everywhere is war. Me say war. War in the east.
By the mid-1900s, East St. Louis was flourishing. Many immigrants from Eastern Europe lived in ethnic enclaves throughout the city, and African Americans remaining after the riots and migrating from the South found promising livelihoods in East St. Louis. But how does an all-American city, just over 50 years ago, become one of America's most troubled cities in its own Soweto, with pervasive economic, environmental, and overall injustice? As labor unions began to rise and demand better working conditions and higher wages, many of the manufacturers and industries began to leave in search of cheaper labor and changing means of production. One company that would remain and continue inflicting its methodic genocide, Monsanto. As African Americans continued to migrate to St. Louis throughout the 1960s, gains from the civil rights movement led to the segregated neighborhoods becoming integrated and the subsequent white flight that accompanied it. By 1971, the local government was handed over to African Americans with the election of the first black mayor. City leaders soon learned just how much of a monopoly the industries and corporations had over this city. As industry continued to decline, jobs continued to leave. The Rust Belt of East St. Louis and the formation of America's Soweto from an all-American city was underway. East St. Louis and its inhabitants would become the poster child and ultimate illustration of how a white, hegemonic, heteropatriarchal plutocracy employs a false concept of democracy to exploit, subjugate, marginalize, and methodically commit genocide against communities of color across this country. Monsanto, whose chemical plants sit adjacent to East St. Louis, and other chemical and manufacturing companies in and around East St. Louis, engaged in a mere conception of democracy that exploited and treated the least privileged as the most expendable, defining them as having the least to lose in terms of the low value of their health, land, and assets, and by implication, their lives. It is important to note that the methodic genocide that Monsanto has inflicted upon these communities reached its climax between 1960 and 1990, when the African American population increased from 45% to 98%, and the percentage of families living in poverty jumped from 11% to 39.2%. It was during this time, in 1987, that Monsanto admitted to dumping 3.8 million pounds of toxic chemicals into the air in its Soweto plant. The processes of de-investment and globalization perpetrated by industry and Monsanto, combined with global market capitalism and hegemonic corporations to destroy the economic, environmental, and community security of East St. Louis. From 1965 to 1969, Monsanto manufactured Agent Orange in its Soweto factory. What is most alarming for Soweto and the adjacent communities of East St. Louis and Cahokia is that the Agent Orange the company produced in its Soweto factory contained the highest levels of dioxin. Without notifying authorities, Monsanto allowed dioxin to enter the St. Louis food chain by dumping 30 to 40 pounds of dioxin into the Mississippi River. Monsanto knowingly, irreparably contaminated the food supply of communities bordering and utilizing the Mississippi River, without regard for human or environmental life. Further exacerbating this devastating contamination of dioxins in the environment is the fact that dioxin does not readily break down, and it accumulates in the fats of human and animals. This causes dioxins to accumulate in the food chain in a more concentrated fashion than in plants, water, soil, or sediments. Dioxins is known to cause cancer. Other ill health effects of dioxin exposure include severe reproductive and developmental problems, damage to the immune system and interference with hormonal systems. Further issues include inability to maintain pregnancy, decreased fertility, reduced sperm counts, endometriosis, diabetes, learning disabilities, immune system suppression, lung problems, skin disorders, lower testosterone levels, and much more. As one scholar pointed out, 80 years of relatively unrestrained disposal has created several areas with notable concentrations of industrial waste. Members of the communities affected by Monsanto's plant operations have sued, but oftentimes with little benefit beyond individual compensation, and no action to reduce or prevent future emissions or releases as the law called for. Courts settled for demanding cessation of waste released to particular pieces of property instead of addressing the plight of these collective communities. The communities in this southwestern area of Illinois have been subjugated to environmental and economic injustices that have affected generations and will continue to affect generations to come. Yet these communities have been expendable to the Monsanto Corporation for the sake of not losing $1 of business. Even though the toxic chemicals were released into these communities several decades ago, a study in 2008 collected samples of indoor attic dust from dwellings and churches in Cahokia and East St. Louis, Illinois. The results of the study indicated the presence of high levels of PCBs and dioxins present in the attic dust samples of these locations. The concentrated levels of these toxins far exceeded the U.S. EPA's regional screening levels. Local firefighters regularly battle fires of abandoned properties that most likely contain these deadly toxins, re-exposing children and adults to further methodic genocide. The injustices inflicted upon America's Soweto is extensive, both economically and environmentally. Abject poverty exists at every turn, but these ills are not inherent to the people of East St. Louis. Poverty, crime, unemployment, and desolation have been systematically created through exploitative corporations in pursuit of profit and government founded in white supremacy and black subjugation. Beyond the environmental injustices endured by East St. Louis and surrounding communities is the food injustice perpetrated on this area. East St. Louis is a junk food jungle and a food desert, resulting from racial projects that have systematically created widespread hunger, exploitation, and environmental degradation. Just earlier this month, one of two remaining supermarkets closed their doors, leaving only a Save-A-Lot to access fresh produce and healthy food. As employment and economic stability left East St. Louis, supermarkets and grocery store chains did as well. The food desert of East St. Louis is littered with liquor stores, serving as the primary source of food provisioning, where prices are often higher than those found at a supermarket, and fresh fruits and vegetables are unavailable. Options beyond the liquor stores serving as mini markets are convenience stores and gas stations, selling energy-dense and unhealthy foods. Food deserts have far-reaching implications in marginalizing the livelihoods of communities of color, with cumulative and compounding negative effects on health and development of adults and children, and negative implications that extend into education. My heart hurts for the exploited and marginalized livelihoods of the people in East St. Louis. Yet my spirit is conscious of the strength of the people in this community who have endured such perverse and pervasive injustices.
Let the children come. Let your mothers hear you laugh. Let the grown men come. Let your wives and your children see you dance. Women, I want you to weep. Just weep for the living, for the dead. Weep.
Just as the lotus rises from the muddy waters to blossom in the sun, the people of East St. Louis are rising again. Construction of new neighborhoods offers a temporary escape from the surrounding destruction. Economic opportunity with the Casino Queen has created opportunities for employment, and the local economy is beginning to grow. Community gardens are being planted at various locations throughout the community, with many local community organizations taking part. No amount of time can completely heal the methodic environmental and human genocide inflicted upon this community, but time has brought resilience and resistance that offers hope for continued new beginnings. So as the children find joy in life and laugh, as the men dance stirring energy of beautiful possibilities, and the mothers continue to weep for the living, for the dead, for one another, for the struggle, and for happiness, East St. Louis will resist, endure, and rise from the destruction inflicted by America's pursuit of hegemonic white supremacy through globalized capitalism. So yes, as Dean Spade speaks of transformative change, we must claim our legacy of beautiful impossibility. And we must do this in the face of the white elite's perpetrations. And we must begin practicing ways of being with one another and making movement that sustains all life on this planet, without exception. So I conclude this video with a letter to the people regarding the transformation of a conception of democracy into the inception of democracy. Dear people of European Caucasian descent, yes, without your conscious consent, you have been born into a power structure that has afforded you privileges from the moment you took your first breath, and will continue to receive, unless we have change, until your last. Yes, it's true. You will have to relinquish this privilege if all life is to be free. And now that you know this, to remain silent is your conscious consent to genocide through extrajudicial killings in the streets of America and subtle yet brutal genocide of all humanity. Through continued hegemonic heteropatriarchal white supremacist power structures, sanctified with the white Jesus that never existed and baptized in the root of all evil. For it is with the love of money and the root of all evil that genocide, infanticide, and destruction of our life-sustaining Mother Earth, that the white elite have masterminded our own self-induced extinction. Dear all melanin people, wake up, my people. Rise from the ashes of our ancestors. Know that we are the beginnings of humanity. It is this ancient wisdom we must remember. Know thyself, and therein lies the power. As a lotus rises from the muddy waters with a perfect blossom, so will we rise from the chains of oppression and exploitation. We have been kissed too long with lies, and it is time we slap the system with truth. Every day we continue to breathe until our cries are heard, our tears are dried, and our rage is rectified. Speak truth every day and be loved in all you do. As one of the greatest intellectual activists of all time says, justice is what love looks like in public. And until we can walk out of our doors knowing we are free from genocide, exploitation, colonization, food deserts, junk food concrete jungles, and environmental injustices, we must be the trumpet that blows until the walls of this system crumble and every human being and all of Mother Earth have equal rights to liberty.
Gotta believe in love. Gotta believe in love. Oh, yeah. I'm standing on the corner, kinda checking out the vibe. Through the eyes of the rest of men, I'm thinking, live and let survive. Maybe the whole damn world is crazy. Maybe I'm just wise. See, our future is ending and our past compromised. There's gotta be a better way to work things out. Spend some time with your brother, learn what he's about. We're all in this thing together. There's only one great voice for the rich man and the poor. And if hate is the disease, then love is the cure. There's only one great word for us all to share forever. There's only one great voice.